Mr. Slonimsky has a quality that he almost needs no questions. Launch him on any
You can
given
say that again.
launch him on any given musical subject, and we're good for 3 hours. And
How about
delightfully so.
unmusical subjects?
Not so, not so. One thing that fascinated me when we talked last in Washington about a year ago was our discussion about Stravinsky, Nicky. And I brought up the question of how much of the writings, the literary writings of Stravinsky were genuine Stravinsky, and how much of it perhaps came from craft with later editing and revisions by Stravinsky. You defended, as I recall, the idea that it was primarily Stravinsky's ideas and Stravinsky's writing, and I think it'd be very interesting, this particular topic, for us to get into.
Well, all right, I'll try, but you know, Stravinsky is in the habit of suing people, radio stations and television stations for saying things that he doesn't like to hear. So we'll have to be careful about it. And when he sues anybody, he sues them for $1 million or something like that. Have you got $1 million?
No, we don't.
Well, now, as you know, he put up his entire manuscript for sale, and that's $3.5 million. That I calculated is more than the quotations for the entire available manuscripts, extant manuscripts of Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms put together. Possibly you can add Wagner to that. Now, about what Stravinsky did write and what Stravinsky did not write, of course, this is all speculation. It's a matter of literary criticism. It's very obvious that Stravinsky did not write what comes under his name, that is, he did not write it in English. That is obvious. But what I defended, or rather what I maintained, is that this could not be the writing exclusively of his Boswell or his Sancho Panza or whoever.
Eric Fenby.
What?
Is Eric Fenby?
No, not Eric Fenby. His name is Robert Kraft. And it's, well, I will not say that it's crafty, but it's extraordinary that Robert Kraft is an extraordinary writer. Now, he takes Stravinsky's thoughts and he puts them in fantastically sesquipedalian English, and sesquipedalian is the word for it.
Well, this is what I challenged on literary grounds or internal evidence. The kind of esoteric language that is used doesn't sound at all like Stravinsky conversation, whose English conversation is not at all that esoteric or arcane. However highly intellectualized and brilliant it is, it doesn't sound like his conversational manner at all. You defended it, I recall, on the grounds that his intense scholarship, Stravinsky's fascination with language, with Greek, you mentioned,
Yes.
Gives him the kind of vocabulary that would seem to us to be outside of his ken, but which is really
well, of course, he has all that vocabulary. In fact, my guess is that Robert Kraft doesn't know those words, and Stravinsky does. And in some cases, I can testify from my own experience, because I'm a generation younger than Stravinsky, and I went through the same kind of schooling, and I went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and my teacher was Stravinsky's original teacher, and he told me a lot about Stravinsky's slowness in harmony. It took him 3 years to learn elementary harmony that usually takes a bright student like me to learn in a few months. So now, but this is something else again. But what must be understood that it is easier for Stravinsky or for anybody of his type of mentality to utter and to particularly to write words of Greek origin or Latin origin or German words, French words, and so forth. Now, Kraft doesn't know languages, so he could not have possibly quoted all those languages. Furthermore, there are Russian words which Stravinsky makes into English words. But above all, there are all kinds of philosophical and even theological references which are quite of that period in Russia, and words that you find in Russian literature of late 19th century. So this is Stravinsky, and his thoughts are undoubtedly his, because his mind is extremely sharp and full of mental invective. He damns practically everybody except very few people in the musical field, and he has a great power of metaphor. Now, what happens is that he doesn't have the connective tissues. Now, I will try to explain it anatomically, I mean linguistically, that he doesn't know how to operate simple connecting words, prepositions and particles and so forth. And there he makes the most horrible idiomatic errors. But he has no difficulty with a word like sesquipedalian, for instance, because he would know that sesqui means one and a half, and pedalian comes from pes pedis. So that is 1.5 foot long. He would have absolutely no difficulty about it. It would be misleading, and in fact, it would be a solecism
to use a sesquipedalian word.
Yes, a sesquipedalian solecism to say that he doesn't know those words because they are difficult. He doesn't know kid words in English, although he obviously knows words like slang, but also slang, the latest slang that occurs in print. Well, so it's a complicated business, but this is Stravinsky put together by Kraft with connective tissues. I will put it this way: the organs are his, the thoughts are here, the big words are his, and so it's just the arrangement that belongs to Kraft.
Well, what about the earlier works? For example, there has been a report going around for a long time. I think maybe even we discussed it a year ago about the Poetics of Music from 1939, which I had heard there was a lot of help in the preparation of this given by two writers in Paris. Now,
yes.
Is there any? What's
it was
the basis?
Ghost written.
It was ghost.
It was ghost written by Roland Manuel. As simple as that. So Stravinsky dictated the ideas, and Roland Manuel wrote them. Now, that's as simple as that.
And that's common knowledge, or a sense this is authenticated now.
Stravinsky admits the help of 3 people, in fact, Roland Manuel and 2 Russians, Arthur Lurie and Peter Suvchinsky, little known. And so that, as simple as that, but there's nothing wrong about it. I mean, after all, the thoughts are still pure Stravinsky. And those people just put together. Incidentally, I regard those books as absolutely worthless. I don't believe Stravinsky can sue the station for saying that. I mean, Poetics of Music, it's theological, philosophical, Hanslick-oriented hodgepodge. That's what it is.
Yeah. Well, now we've taken care of Mr. Stravinsky's writings. What about your own?
That's different. At least I write my own writings. There's no question about that. And I write some words that people claim don't exist.
Now, in this Baker's Biographical Dictionary, by which for most of us is one of the most important immediate references and most, I think, dependable references, because of your scholarship in this is so accurate that one can rely on it very, very, very well. Now, what about the question of, for example, I heard you had trouble finding and authenticating Ludwig Minkus, and that one of the reasons that Ludwig, the famous Ludwig or infamous Ludwig Minkus, is not in the Baker's Biographical Dictionary is that you're not really convinced that he existed.
No, I'm convinced that he existed because he drew a salary from the Imperial Theater in Russia up to 1891. In 1891, he simply vanished into thin air, no reference to the presentation or the hour. And it's one of those fantastic things. I mean, I could tell you the stories that are that simply require the intervention of a detective, but even a detective cannot solve a problem like this. He just vanished, and I investigated in Russia. I investigated in Vienna. In fact, the Russian encyclopedists keep begging me to find out what happened to him, because they are still playing his abominable compositions that are worthless musically, of course. When Prokofiev wanted to describe Stravinsky's neoclassical compositions, he says, "This is not Stravinsky, this is Minkus." to damn it completely, you know. And this is what Minkus was. Now, what can I do with him? I can't have people with question marks in my dictionary. It's enough to say that most composers, and certainly all prima donnas, lie about their ages, and I have to get their birth certificates to prove that they were, let's say, 12 years older than they claim to be, and so on and so forth. But there are things that are absolutely fantastic, and I'd better not use the time on the air for that, because there are perhaps more fascinating things to discuss which are purely musical. But let me tell you, this situation is now, as I begin to investigate, is approaching the point of criminal delinquency, deliberate distortion of facts on the part of famous and infamous composers, and just plain unavailability of information. And that concerns everything. The question of who composed what, who wrote what book. That Liszt's book on Chopin was not written by him at all, that most 19th century stuff is practically impossible to authenticate with any certainty, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, everybody knows that Beethoven's wrote his Ninth Symphony. Nobody says that
Francis Bacon,
Burgmüller, or Robert Kraft wrote it. That's all very true. But other things, lesser things, I mean, it's just you enter into a world of fantasy. And let me tell you that I had thought that I had reached the rock bottom of all kinds of confusions. You know, you probably know about Mozart's funeral, because I published an article on it. Now, in every damn dictionary, is that all right to say damn?
Sure.
In the air? All right. In every dictionary, including Grove, it says that Mozart was buried during a terrible blizzard in Vienna in December. He died in December, and that therefore no one accompanied his body to his grave. Therefore, he was buried in a pauper's grave, and all this sort of thing. And some writers add even the exact description of the snowballs that were formed under the feet, so they could not follow it. Now, the thing sounded fishy to me all the time, because Mozart's immediate biographers, particularly Nissen, who married Mozart's widow, never mentioned that blizzard, and there was no mention of that blizzard until 1856, and that in January, and that was exactly the centennial of Mozart's birth. And then I finally located the first mention of it. It was a Vienna paper, which corresponds in its veracity and dependability to the pre-Commanday Hearst papers.
I've never worked on a Hearst
I
paper,
see.
so
Well, I just wanted to
plead
make
that-
absolutely sure that you never never worked on a Hearst paper.
No.
Well, I'm glad to know that you never did. Well, anyway, so that is that, and so that went into all the dictionaries. So what did I do? I did the most elementary thing of all. I wrote to the Vienna Weather Bureau, and I asked what the weather was on December 6th, 1791, when Mozart was buried. And I found, they kept records for 250 years, I found that it was a rather mild December day, and that there was a little drizzle in the afternoon, and in the morning, and in the afternoon, when Mozart's body was carried to the cemetery, the temperature was 5 above 0 Reaumur, that is, it's 5 above the freezing point. So there was absolutely no question of any blizzard. No snow could be formed, and as I say for Vienna, it wasn't a bad day for December. So the whole thing was invented. Now, not only that, but I found that particular article in the Vienna Montagblatt, which appeared on Monday when no other papers appeared, as usual, contained all kinds of stories about Mozart, for instance, that Mozart went to his favorite tavern and then he felt ill, and the tavern keeper looked at him and noticed that Mozart didn't even finish his favorite wine, and then he said to himself, the tavern keeper, our maestro must be ill because he didn't finish his favorite wine. Now, when it comes to that the thoughts of a tavern keeper are reported as fact 100 years after the birth of the subject, then I become, justifiably suspicious.
Yes.
And so I found that the whole thing was just absolutely an invention in that worthless paper, and we find it in Grove and everywhere, about that blizzard and everything. Now, of course, they are changing it because apparently the director of the Weather Bureau in Vienna realized why I was asking for that particular day, so he went to the chairman of the music department of the University of Vienna and asked him how come, and he mumbled something very unreasonable because that particular person published a book on Mozart. He introduced precise dimensions of the snowballs formed there, which were not even given in that particular article, a copy of which I finally obtained. Hundreds of books have been written on Mozart, but not one of them quoted that particular account of Mozart's funeral. And it was not even signed. It was signed a man of the people.
Now, in your Bakers, your editions of the Bakers, and you're having a new one coming out next year. The
Yes.
sixth edition comes out next
Yes.
year.
What do you mean next year? I'm reading the proofs.
That's next
And
year
these-
by the time it gets
Well, no. It will be. They are rushing it. They are selling out.
Wonderful.
And these two gentlemen's names will be in. On our, I hope your name will be in if you are not too shy about your vital statistics.
Depends on what you mean by vital.
I mean
But
vital,
that's-
where and when you were born, because
Yes.
most people, when they were born in 1925, let's say, after 5 years, they shifted to 1926 and then 1927 and so forth by the time
Yes.
they approach a
They're
venerable
going
age.
now. There are, I assume, substantial changes in even classical biographical.
Yes, numerous additions.
Can you think of any startling ones that is connected with famous people that like the Mozart idea that really debunks or
Yes,
upsets the apple cart?
Well, fortunately, I didn't mention the blizzard at all in my article on Mozart because I just let it go, because at that time when the first edition appeared, my first edition, the Mozart situation was not clear. It was before I got the document from the Weather Bureau in Vienna. So there will be a number of minor changes. I did not discover that Beethoven was really nom de plume for Haydn, and nothing of the sort, and nothing world-shaking. But there are all kinds of annoying little things that are really very bad, that names of teachers, somebody studied with somebody who really died before he was born, and stuff like that.
Yes.
But fortunately, very little. Some of the annoying ones, to which I plead guilty, and as I said, my supplement will be called addenda corrigenda atque pudenda, meaning things to be ashamed of. Not in any anatomical sense, because I could have verified certain things. For instance, I said that the Queen of Spain gave Sarasate his Stradivarius violin. Nothing of the sort happened. Sarasate bought it with his own money. That is
Yes.
And I had the documentation. I had this Spanish biography, which I just failed to read because I trusted the previous editions of this dictionary and other dictionaries. But then, of course, there were things. Now, I don't know whether you would regard the name of Sigismund Thalberg as of any significance. Now, he was...
in the List legend, in the List canon. It's, in
yes,
the whole
well, all
canon of-
right. So you read Grove's dictionary or any other dictionary, and you find that he was an illegitimate son of a baroness and a minor German duke. All right. So, and Grove's dictionary adds a footnote that the birth certificate of what he was born in Geneva was lost. Now, I wrote to Geneva and I got it by return mail. And he was nothing of the sort. He was a perfectly legitimate child. He was no bastard. And his father's name was Thalberg, and not any kind of duke. And his mother was not a baroness, and his father was a Frankfurt merchant. So why all this for 100 years, for 150 years? Why that footnote of Grove? Now, I was very close to the editor of Grove, too, so I wrote him a funny letter. I said, what's going on so with those things, you know? And so he gave one of those cynical explanations. Said, I'm not going to check on every report of illegitimacy, and that sort of thing. But it's very annoying because my very great friend, now of course he's no longer with us, Arthur Lesser, wrote a remarkable book. Men, Women,
Pianos.
and Pianos. Now there he quotes a letter from Thalberg's mother in which she writes to the alleged father of the child from Geneva, and she tells him, and that is a letter reproduced, in it that the child is born and undoubtedly he is destined for greatness. Just why, I don't know. I know a friend of mine just had a daughter, and she's destined for greatness because she can sing an octave higher than Gali Kurci in the Bell Song of Lakme. Great, but you see, still it's very unusual that the person would know when the child is born topless and practically bottomless, and all of a sudden that she's destined for greatness. Now, why was he destined for greatness? Not even that. She said in that letter that he will be as deep as the valley, that is Tal in German, and as high as the mountain, that is Berg in German. So now if this is not convincing, then I ask you.
Yes.
So let us call him Thalberg. But this was his name in the birth certificate, and there weren't any illegitimate parents to this business. Now, this letter was manufactured, I suspect, and I'm tracking it down, by Thalberg and his public relations business, because in the 19th century it was very tempting to be an illegitimate son of some kind of a petty duke. You see, but to be the son of a Frankfurt merchant, well, that's not interesting. And it's true that he was taken up by that duke and finally and was educated and all this sort of thing. But the entire story is out of thin air,
Yes.
again, to use our word.
You
So
mentioned-
what are you going to do with that?
You mentioned in discussing Thalberg, and we come into the List pupils, and we discussed just before we went on the air the whole question of phony prodigies, and the minute a famous composer, a famous performer dies, immediately the prodigies and proteges spring out of the woodwork. And,
Sure.
You were talking about Schoenberg, for example, how all of a sudden the Schoenberg pupils became legion after. In
Well,
recent
I
years.
mean, Schoenberg, after all, was not Liszt, and some people think that they shouldn't confess that they were Schoenberg pupils because maybe people will not hire them as piano teachers because they don't want to learn the Schoenberg type of thing. But this is going on all the time, and if I may tell tell a very corny anecdote. Are corny anecdotes allowed on the air? Perfectly decent, but terribly corny. And I cannot even vouch for its authenticity, but it's a pretty good story. And it's about Paderewski, who lived near New York in the last years of his life. And he used to take a walk in Westchester County, and he passed by a cottage, and he heard the sounds of his famous minuet. Paderewski listened to this, and he couldn't stand that F natural in his G major minuet. So he approached the door of the cottage, and there was a shingle saying, Miss Helen Springle, teacher of piano. So she opened the door, and he said, my name is Paderewski. He said, she said, oh, Maestro Paderewski, why, I'm overwhelmed. He said, would you do me a favor? He said, why, she said, anything. Will you please play F sharp in my minuet? So she said, well, of course. A couple of weeks later, he passed by the same cottage, and he heard the following. Great, F sharp and all. But there was a new shingle, much larger, and it said, Miss Helen Springle, teacher of piano, only American pupil of Paderewski. Now, as I say, a corny anecdote, and I cannot guarantee its authenticity, but in a way it's illustrative of the situation.
Well, I don't want to hog all the question time, but why don't we turn from Slonimsky, the encyclopedist, lexicographer, detective extraordinaire, and all, an editor and a writer on music, and talk about Slonimsky, the musician, which I think he would probably think of as his first and closest and most important role.
Let me ask one thing
Go
about
ahead,
that,
Charles.
because I'm curious about, you did a lot of conducting of the works of Ives in the 30s, I guess it was, and premiered some of his pieces. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with him?
Well, that is quite a chapter. You know, I knew Ives very well. I used to stay at his summer place in West Reading, Connecticut, and at his brownstone house in 67th Street in New York. And I was as close to him as anyone could be. And I must say that even when he was totally unknown, I realized that I was confronted with a genius, with a real genius. He was very ill. He had a diabetic condition. He could not write. When he was still in his early 50s, he had to stop composing, and he even wrote very few letters. I'm the proud possessor of about 25 letters in his own earthquaking handwriting, which incidentally I'm reproducing in the new edition of my book, Music Since 1900, which is scheduled for publication this year in September. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by the power of his music, as who isn't now, but except that it was 1931. And then I had in Boston a little organization which was called the Chamber Orchestra of Boston. And I tried to give new compositions, mostly composers who were utterly unrecognized, like Henry Cowell and Edgar Varese, and of course Charles Ives. In fact, Henry Cowell published a little article in a now defunct magazine with a title which now appears absolutely fantastic, and I just want to give you this title. The title was 4 Little Known Modern Composers, colon, Chavez, Ives, Slonimsky, Weiss. 4 little-known composers, published in 1928. That's an article by Cowell. Now, Ives saw very few people because of his condition and because he was a genuine American recluse and an eccentric. He was really on the direct line from Thoreau. He never owned a radio or a record player, and he was not subscribed to any newspaper or magazine. His wife, whose first name was Harmony, subscribed to the London Spectator, which took 6 weeks to reach here. When I remember in 1933, I told Ives about Hitler, he suddenly rose erect and he said, "Then why doesn't someone do something about that man?" You know, this was Ives. It was so typical. Why doesn't someone do something about that man? Because he thought that if someone would just tell him, "Now, you little pipsqueak, you just don't do those bad things." You know, this is the way he operated. He actually did not know about the election of Roosevelt in 1932 for several weeks. I mean, this just gives you an idea of what kind of a person that was. And he was not a sort of a well, I don't want to have such comparisons as Howard Hughes or somebody like that, you know. But he lived in a world by himself. Now, yet he was a successful insurance man. I mean, this is a matter of record now. And somehow I found, Henry Cowell introduced me to him, and Henry Cowell at that time was running the New Music Edition, publication for ultramodern composers. And incidentally, I had my first work published by that edition, and Ives had several works published, and Varese and Wallingford Rieger, practically the entire left avant-garde, if there is such a thing, of American music at the time. And specifically, it was for ultramodern music that could not be published commercially. Well, and then Ives remarked, we had lunch together, and he said, "Well, why don't we arrange a concert of American music?" And then he said, "Well, of course, I would like to participate in it." And that was his word. Well, his participation was very simple. His participation was paying all the bills for the publication of New Music by Cowell, financing my concerts in Europe, financing my recordings, and I did the first recordings of Charles Ives. I'm very proud of it. I mean, this recording is now a collector's item. And so, and the first recording of Varese's ionization score, which is incidentally dedicated to me. Anyway, I didn't realize perhaps myself then that I was among the greatest musical minds of the century. I knew that they were great, but I thought that I was just, that there was something wrong with me, that nobody thinks much about those people, and I think that they were so tremendously stimulating. And then I asked him about 3 places in New England, and I proposed to him that I should arrange with the C.C. Birch and Company in Boston to publish it. So I went to C.C. Birch, and I knew Birch personally, and I put it up to him. And so he at first he hesitated, and he said, "Well, it's a totally unknown name, and do you think there will be any performances?" So I said, "Well, there will be a performance by me anyway, and it will be a world premiere given 25 years after its composition." And so Burchard agreed to have this published, and needless to say, Ives paid all bills for publication. And then he had this very peculiar way of asking me what my financial condition was at the time, which could be defined in one word: deplorable. So, and then he said, "Well, you said, this is not fair that you should be doing all this work and you shouldn't be at least compensated for it. And then he wrote me in a letter, very typical. Mrs. Ives tells me that, well, repeating the same, that she feels it's most unfair that you should do all this work without compensation, and so she suggests that I should send you a small check in appreciation. That small check was not small at all. Usually it was $100, $150, and $200. That was plenty. And for my European trip, he gave me a check for $4,000. And that was in 1931. That was real money, and he was not a millionaire.
Where did you conduct those European concerts?
I conducted them in Paris, in Berlin, and in Budapest.
With the major orchestras of those cities?
With the Berlin Philharmonic. And that Berlin Philharmonic concert was, I dare say, a sensation of the season. I understand that there was nearly a murder committed in the hall because the leftists were attacked by the nascent Nazis, if I may use an alliteration, and that was, of course, before the Nazis. And I made the front pages even in America, riots at American concert and so forth. And the venerable critic of the Boston Herald, Philip Hale, wrote an article entitled Mr. Slonimsky in Paris, in which he offered this opinion. Mr. Slonimsky, well known for his predilection for the extreme modernism, has not done justice to American music by presenting for Parisians the scores by wild-eyed anarchists, composers who are not regarded as representative of American music at all. He could have played works by Loeffler, Foote, or Hill that are representative of true American music. Instead, he selected names totally unknown. Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, Carl Ruggles, Wallingford Rieger, Carlos Chavez, and so on and so forth down the list. And so he damned me for doing this thing and misrepresenting American music in Paris and in Berlin, and that was very, very curious, because now I see that whatever glamour I possess as formerly a symphonic conductor is due to those concerts. In fact, very recently a whole crew of cameramen came from the Cologne television to record my talk about my concerts and so forth. And those people who heard those concerts never forgot them. When I conducted ionization and I recorded it in New York, I found that the New York Philharmonic men could not master those rhythms. I mean, they could not count in 5 very quickly, and particularly when one beat was omitted. So in the end, the entire orchestra, I mean, it was a percussion orchestra, had to be disbanded, and I found myself conducting an orchestra of absolute stars in musical composition. Carlos Salcedo was doing the Chinese blocks. Cowell was pounding the piano with his forearms. Varese was manning 2 firemen's sirens, which are in the score. And then William Schumann, formerly president of Lincoln Center, gave a lecture at UCLA where I was teaching at the time several years ago, and he surprised me by telling a story about me, which I didn't know. He said, incidentally, I find many friends here, and I find a man who launched me on my performing career. That is Nicolas Slonimsky, here present in this hall, who gave me the part of a lion's roar in ionization. said, this was a great opportunity for me, but unfortunately I didn't do so well because the engagement was not renewed and I had to go into composing and musical administration.
Why is it that you didn't continue as a conductor? Was there a reason for that?
Permit me to chuckle in a sinister, ominous, hateful, and self-pitying vein. That was 1931, 32, 33. I conducted the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and actually I made quite a success. One paper, true, it was a sort of an avant-garde paper, wrote the Philharmonic gets a shot in the arm, meaning that it was somnolent and I woke them up. They had to wake up because in the Ives piece, for instance, I conducted one rhythm, one tempo in the right hand and another tempo in the left hand. And one critic said that my conducting was evangelical because my right hand knew not what my left hand was doing. But the fact remains that I did manage to conduct it this way now, and if there were a visual radio, then you would see what was going on in the Ives score, 3 bars against 4. And then I performed ionization at the Hollywood Bowl. You see, I was engaged at the Hollywood Bowl for the entire season because I did make a splash. And, at that time, it was a depression. They needed a splash. And I remember old man Alfred Hertz, the father of the Hollywood Bowl, came to the rehearsal. And, of course, those men could not master those rhythms the same as in New York. And so in desperation, I went to the snare drum player and I beat out the time for him. And Hertz asked me afterwards, said, "Are you a professional drummer?" So I said, "No, I never touched a drum in my life before, but I could count 5/16, and those people just couldn't." I mean, now, of course, any Juilliard student can do that. I mean, there's nothing to it.
Tell me, we hear today constantly that American orchestras, some American orchestras and players particularly, are used to new and music and tricky rhythms, are sometimes quicker learning and quicker to catch on to new devices than European orchestras, which have more or less a static repertoire. I begin to infer, and maybe you can confirm or deny this, that perhaps in 1931 the reverse was the case. Did the Berlin Philharmonic, for example, in 1931, or whenever it was, 32,
Yes.
were they more adept at these tricky rhythms than the New York Philharmonic?
Infinitely more adept. I'll never forget the way the Berlin Philharmonic played all those fantastic scores, which were terribly difficult to perform. And now I am not usually a shrinking violet, but I cannot quote to you some of the reviews that I got in Berlin. I mean, some of them were absolutely fantastic. I mean, full of praise. For instance, no less a person than Albert Einstein wrote to me, "Das ist ein Talent ersten Ranges." Now, he just was not addicted to such thing. I will leave it untranslated so that I will not be too ashamed of it.
You haven't yet answered Charles
I see.
Amirkhanian's question, though, about what
Why?
interrupted your performing career.
I know. Well,
That-
this is
digress.
sort of a prelude. Now there will be an interlude, and then there will be a very sad
Second act,
epilogue,
right.
and
Second
a
act.
coda, and a codetta. Now, this is so. All this went in, and I really had those terrific reviews in Paris and Berlin. On the strength of those reviews, I was engaged by various orchestras in America. Then I proceeded to play all those works. And, of course, the attendance dropped disastrously. The Los Angeles Times led a regular campaign against me as some kind of a monster coming out of darkest Russia to confound and to corrupt the musical mores in Southern California and so forth. And then finally, a woman, I forgot her name, she recently died at the age of 97, and she who held the purse strings, she simply told the manager, pay him off for the entire season, but get rid of that man because he will ruin the Hollywood Bowl and everything. Now, it's very interesting. Now, of course, the Los Angeles Philharmonic and the Hollywood Bowl and everybody, they all play the works that I performed there for the first time. And it's simply fantastic when I see those programs. I mean, and they are hits. The Ives and the Varese works, and now even Carl Ruggles. Now, when I was the first to give the performance of the Sun Treader by Carl Ruggles, which has now been recorded and everything. Carl Ruggles is still living. He's 95 years old. And so I gave it in Paris, and a French viola player, I had the part, marked viola. And he added il in front of viola and la musique after viola. It came out in French, il viola la musique. He violated music. See, now this was the atmosphere even in Paris. I conducted Bartók's first piano concerto with Bartók at the piano, and that was damned, particularly in the American newspapers, in Paris as being an atrocious work and all this sort of thing. I have it all in my book, Lexicon of Musical Invective.
Did this experience, do you think this is the experience that initiated the idea or generated the idea for the Dictionary of Musical Invective?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact,
it
comes from my heart, and particularly since I simply adored and relished those expressions. I mean, the invectives that they poured on me. For instance, I'll never forget what they wrote about a perfectly innocent piece by Wallingford Riga.
The sweetest man that ever lived.
Yes, and so he had to die very curious, nearly said the dog's death, because he was actually caught in a dog's leash, and he fell on the street and suffered a brain concussion and so forth. Now, so one critic wrote as follows, and I quote, well, I will not say it in German, it was in Berlin. This music sounded as if a pack of rats were being slowly tortured to death. And then from time to time, a dying cow would moan. Now, this is a beautiful, surrealistic picture worthy of Dali. So now they really could write. Now, after this Hollywood Bowl experience, that was my Waterloo. You see, I was blacklisted. I mean, everybody knew my name, and everybody knew what I did in Europe and in New York, and that was just a general consensus that was a dangerous person who conducted such abominations as Free Places in New England by Charles Ives, Ionization by Varese, The Sun Treader by Carl Ruggles, all now practically in the repertoire of every orchestra, and I'm very proud to say in every case it says, first performance given by Nicolas Slonimsky, and I smile wryly. And so the result of this was very obvious. I could not obtain a single engagement with any orchestra. And Henry Cowell wrote in his book on Charles Ives that I was a martyr to my insistence on playing music that was not of its time.
Well, the question that springs immediately to my mind, thinking of this period when you were blacklisted and when you were killed as a conductor, what was Koussevitzky's attitude towards what you were doing, and wasn't there any possibility or was there any suggestion that he might come in and help or encourage you in any way? What was your relationship to Koussevitzky at this point?
Oh, now
or Stokowski, for that matter?
You are touching a very sensitive point, because my relationship to Koussevitzky was a very definite one. That was he was wonderful for Copland and Piston and Roy Harris and other American composers, but he simply could not understand Schoenberg, Varese, let alone Ives. And Copland tried to sell Ives to Koussevitzky. told Koussevitzky that Ives was a great composer and that Koussevitzky ought to play it, and he just couldn't do it. I mean, he said, I can't do this music. The same with Schoenberg. He could not hear it. And when I saw Schoenberg for the last time, Schoenberg asked me why Koussevitzky was not playing his works. So I told him quite frankly that he cannot understand it. He doesn't have the understanding of the language. And so Schoenberg looked at me and he said, aber spielt doch Brahms, but he plays Brahms, which is a significant comment on Schoenberg's mentality.
Yes.
You know, so between all those people, you know, I felt that I myself was going slightly batty.
What about Stokowski?
Well, Stokowski did do
The Fourth Symphony.
Varese,
Yes,
but
and-
he just didn't reach Ives until, of course, a few years ago when he did the Fourth Symphony with several conductors. But I did it all by myself, not the Fourth Symphony, but similar works all by myself by devising this method of conducting two different tempi with my two hands.
But what about your relationship to Stokowski in this period?
So Stokowski, I mean, I knew Stokowski. I mean, there was no relationship whatsoever. I tried to, as I say, the concertmaster Richard Borgin of the Boston Symphony Orchestra finally did 3 places in New England, which was not the first performance, but I practically forced him to do it. I mean, that was after Koussevitzky. I gave the score to him, and I said, "This is Ives is a great name." Ives was still living, and I practically put it over with the Borgen, and he was very unhappy too because he could not he could not get accustomed to this particular sort of disheveled idiom. But Koussevitzky could not make head or tail of it. I mean, and as I say now, any Juilliard student just plays it, just like nobody's business, not to mention those young conductors who now are doing it all over the place. Thomas in Boston and Zubin Mehta.
We're going to preempt our next program, Golden Voices, with a program on Dame Clara Butt. So, Mr. Slonimsky, we can go on for another half hour because we have several things we want to ask you about. So if those of you listening will tune in next week on Thin Air, we'll play Dame Clara Butt for you at 3:30.
Oh, Dame
Can you
Clara
follow that, Bob?
Butt.
Yes, but I'd like to ask him who Dame Clara Butt is.
Oh, why don't you look her up in this dictionary?
All right, we'll do that right now.
Never mind that dame. But you see, and I'd better get going fast.
Nicholas, I'd
Yeah.
like to ask you about your music because I know that KQED Television has recorded studies in black and white for a broadcast on the third Monday in March. And what has happened to your music? I mean, it's not on record, it's not available, and nobody can listen to it anymore.
Now everybody who has $4.95 in his pocket can listen to 45 minutes of my compositions, which will be issued by the Orion record. It's a wonderful little company in Los Angeles that specializes in forgotten music or music that nobody wants to hear. See, now this is my music, although he swears that it will be a bestseller because, you see, it's a combination, I mean, through the years, it's a combination, unholy mixture of schmaltz, camp, and superannuated sophistication. So I don't know.
What pieces are on the record?
Well, they are my studies in black and white, which, as a matter of fact, stand up pretty well as early modernism, but modernism in reverse. You see, everybody was writing dissonances. So I said to myself, why don't I write a whole suite that would contain only consonances, but arranged in such a way that each horizontal line would be either atonal or modal, and vertically there would be a total polytonality. Polytonality in the sense that the tonality will be shifting with practically every note. And I found that it lent itself to fascinating possibilities.
Can
Now
we
this,
hear some of it?
yes, indeed. Now I just want to say that the right hand plays on the white keys only, the left hand plays on the black keys only. Hence, it's called Studies in Black and White, and there is not a single discord, not even a passing seventh in the carload. If you hear a discord, that means that that I slipped. I will play for you a march from this suite. I'll play typographical errors. In 1928, and it was published by Henry Cowell in his New Music edition.
Now, when does this compose in relationship to the microcosmos? Because I think immediately when you talk about the kinds of restrictions and coming out in such a way of some of the restrictions that that Bartók set for himself in the different etudes in the microcosmos. Now, when was he doing that? I'd forgotten the dates.
Well, I preceded Bartók by at least 5 years. Now, please don't draw any conclusions.
Well, I heard that reminds me, I don't want to get away from too much, but as a footnote to that, I heard the interesting story that Bartók, once having heard some music by Henry Cowell and heard the tone clusters for the first time, actually went to Cowell and asked Cowell in a sort of very gracious way for permission to use these effects in his music.
It's amazing because the story is actually 75% true, which is a very high degree of accuracy. He didn't go to Cowell, but he wrote him a letter.
Uh-huh.
And he asked for permission to use it, and he did use it in his second piano concerto.
Yes.
And so, very much in passing. And this is completely true. Of course, it was in the air. Microcosmos of Béla Bartók is mostly dissonant and modal. This is different. This is really bitonal.
Yes.
But since it was published in 1929, I mean, it's just conceivable that Béla Bartók had seen it. I mean, it was in the air, so I wouldn't even presume to say that it was of any significance. I'd like to talk about my scales afterwards because there is a direct connection. Now, you see, at the same time, I was fascinated by possibilities of combining different scales instead of playing the same, major, minor scales, chromatic, and some altered scales. I decided to codify all those scales according to a different principle. I simply cannot go into the details on the air, but let me tell you briefly that I, for instance, can combine two different scales, playing, let's say, C major in the right hand and E major in the left hand. That would be polytonal, but they are all consonances again, because they're all sixths, only they sound strange. And as a matter of fact, since Mr. Commanday mentioned Bartók has this principle in the second movement of his concerto for orchestra. They are sixths, but those sixths are unrelated. Now, Now then, I will play for you first just straight bitonality, C major against E major. Then bitonality and polyrhythmy, or rather birhythmic combination, meaning that I will have, let's say, 4 notes in the right hand in C major against 3 notes in the left hand of E major. This would mean that I would run 4 octaves in the right hand and against 3 octaves in the left hand. Then finally 5 notes against 4 in 2 different tonalities. Now, I dare say that it is pretty difficult, but you see, I developed this condition which is known as controlled schizophrenia, or self-propelled schizophrenia, whereby I can separate the 2 hemispheres of my brain that would act independently. And so I'll play for you some of those scales. Now, let's say I'll start with C major in the left hand, E major in the right hand straight, and then 4 against 3 and 5 against 4, changing tonalities. I don't have to be precise as to what particular keys I'm playing.
Come out of an era where your control, both as a conductor in terms of controlling simultaneous but conflicting rhythmic patterns, and dealing with the complexities of Charles Ives, Varese, other composers, and I'd like to know what your response is to the free-controlled mixing of ideas that occurs in contemporary music, or that is in what was now considered avant-garde music, where the composers gives so much choice to the performers. It indicates in the case of Paderewski, or in the case of a number of composers today, great vast areas, episodes, even entire compositions where the performers have a multiple selection, either given numbers of patterns to draw on or various ideas. Now, you as a member of and as a kind of a pioneer in the early avant-garde, what is your relationship and response to the present avant-garde?
My response is that of fascination, but with this qualification that it is not new. As a matter of fact, Charles Ives, or for that matter Mahler, had whole sections in free improvisation. I don't want to give a lecture, but Mozart had something similar to that. There were all kinds of things. Well, the imbroglio, for instance, was free, and then there were his all kinds of little games, that permitted departures. And as a matter of fact, the figured bass, cembalo, the foundation of Baroque music, was also free. And if we could hear the recordings as I did, the recordings, the old cylinders of Edison cylinders, the way all those great musicians and supposedly great pedants played, they would be thrown out of any school of music for allowing such liberties. I don't have to tell you. I mean, you know very well that the performers were much more free in the 19th century than they are now. So, to my mind, this is a very healthy development. Of course, I have a sense of humor, and I can't help it even when I go to one of those concerts, and when I hear things, or I don't hear things that are obviously not even at random, but not well done. You see, what my objection is to all those modern, ultra-modern things, including John Cage, whom I admire very much for his wit. I think the wittiest remark he ever made was when someone asked him after a lecture, said, "What about the future?" And said, "Oh, but the future, that's passé." Now, the man has a Goethe-Steinesque wit, but it has nothing to do with what he produces. I think that he and David Tudor and all of them lack an ability that any circus clown, any two-bit magician has, as a matter of fact. I mean, they are not magicians at all. I mean, it's all so transparent. For instance, 15 years ago, John Cage invited me to the world premiere of his water music in Boston at Harvard University. So he said, unlike Handel's, it actually splashes. Now, naturally, I went immediately, so there he was, and David Tudor, his faithful pianist, sat down at the piano, and he had some kind of a pitcher and a pan, and so when the great moment came for a splash, I expected that they would have some kind of a laundromat there on the stage and really flood the audience. I mean, I was all set for it, I was so excited. And so what happened? He began to pour that water into the pan, and I couldn't hear a sound. I was sitting with a rather well-known composer, Boston composer, so he was not too avant-garde, and I whispered to him, I said, "I don't hear any splashing. I want my money back, even though I got a free ticket." And so, no splashing. And so there was an early bearded beatnik, that was before the hippie period, and he turned to me and from the front row and whispered, really with great anger, "If you don't like this music, why did you come?" So I said, "I adore this music, but I don't hear enough of it." And so that's the whole point. I mean, the performance quality is absolutely helpless. Now, I heard the concert of the topless cellist, Charlotte Moorman now. It's all very well, but first of all, I had to pay $3 for it, and in San Francisco, I paid only 75 cents for 3 topless performers to watch them. But anyway, the point is that they were slow, both in undressing and dressing and laundering her dress and so forth. It took so long that that attention or even lust or whatever it was supposed to evoke was slow. Now, this is my objection. And then the famous Korean composer June Paik, whose works I admire tremendously. He couldn't even manage the accompaniment to Le Cygne of Saint-Saëns, that swan. He just couldn't make those arpeggios. God knows what he played, but he's a great composer. For instance, on February 9th, he composed a piece which shook Los Angeles, or so he claims, and he said that he expected Los Angeles to go up in flames. And and he also wrote a great piece which was performed by my teaching assistant at UCLA, which was called Playing Music Number 4. And the instructions were very simple. Cut not less than 10 centimeters with a straight razor on your left arm. So the guy came out and cut not less than 10 centimeters on his left arm. There was some blood, and someone shouted from the back room, said, "Encore, use your throat." So now this is a fact. You see, he was my teaching assistant at UCLA, and as the Romans said, nomina sunt odiosa, meaning I will not publicize his name. And so I had to ask him after the show. I asked him whether he regarded himself as clinically sane. So he said, "Of course." You see, and then he looked at me very sadly, and he said, "Nicholas, I fear for your image in posterity." So naturally, I was taken aback. I sat down and said, for God's sake, tell me what's wrong with my image in posterity. She said, you've been a pioneer, and for me is now you rise against the most vital manifestations of new music. So I said, well, it may be vital, blood and everything, but you see, I just don't feel that there is enough music in it. And well, anyway, so now under such circumstances, I say, of course, it's extremely amusing. And most of those people are friends of mine, and I'm having a absolutely hilarious correspondence with them. I mean, some of them are solemn, but most of them have a marvelous sense of humor. I don't know whether this humor is suicidal or homicidal or whatever sidal that humor is. And I'm all in favor of humor. Goodness gracious, I perpetrated some terrible things. For instance, I wrote a piece called Anatomy of Melancholy for a cat. And the percussion ensemble, now, of course, I couldn't perform it because of the regulations of the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, because, you see, the cat's tail had to be pulled, you see, at every sforzando, you see, in that piece. And I even designed a special partition with a hole in it so that the performer would not be scratched by the cat. And then I ran into trouble with the union because theoretically they charged a minimum of $37.50 for any kind of performance with any kind of musical instrument, even if it were a cat. So I had to replace it by a muted oboe, even though the oboe couldn't be muted. Well, so I've done all kinds of things along those lines. I wrote an orchestral piece called My Toy Balloon with the participation of 100 colored balloons, which were to be exploded at the climax. And this, incidentally, has been performed by all major orchestras, and I never saw the New York Philharmonic men so absolutely childishly elated by just this opportunity of perforating those balloons with hat pins that were provided, of course, for the purpose. The union did not object, but there was some difficulty with the Philadelphia orchestra. So the union regarded this as an doubling brass, and so forth. But anyway, that thing is the foundation of my prosperity as far as ASCAP.
How long ago were these kinds of compositions, the Anatomy of a Melancholy for Cat?
Well, it's about 1940s. That toy balloon piece. I picked it up in Brazil. I mean, I actually used a Brazilian tune, and I wrote a set of variations for it.
Could you play the piano backwards for us?
But will you have an audio-visual
No, we'll just verify that you're standing with your back to the keyboard.
Well, look, I could do all kinds of crazy things. I can play the Blue Danube Waltz with my feet. And, well, see, you name the crazy thing, and I can do, but I can do it, and not only in music. But at least, all I say that at least I try. I actually practice on it, and that produces an impression. But it's too bad that, well, it's like this. You see, I'll play for you backwards. I mean, these gentlemen will testify that I do play backwards, and that's Ach du lieber Augustin. And the result is about the degree of excellence that my piano pupils achieve playing straight. Yes, well, maybe I ought to change my profession now and go into vaudeville.
Can you play a 12-tone version of that piece?
Oh, yes. Do you want a 13-tone version? I can do that. Yes, that I arranged, as a matter of fact, and it's published in my book, The Road to Music.
like to ask you some questions now about the developments that have come on to us since Scriabin, and perhaps even from before, earlier than Scriabin, in terms of multimedia developments. Now, most of the composers that were in the avant-garde that you were discussing, Varese, Ruggles, Ives, that there's a quality of multimedia in their viewpoint, certainly in Ives' viewpoint, even though the technical facilities were not always at his disposal. And but now today we have a very.
Well, how do you mean that? Because Ives, for instance, intended you only to hear the sound. So how is that multimedia?
In the sense that there was a programmatic intent only, and.
But what's the second medium then?
Literature.
Well, he composed the
Literary
Universe
references.
Symphony that was supposed to be played in the valley with the reverberators formed by four mountains. And he had the score of this symphony begun. And I would like to mention a composer whose name is totally unknown. Well, I suppose Mr. Cross or Mr. Amirkhanian or probably Mr. Commanday will come up with that name. But his name was Nicolas Obukhov. Does this mean anything to you, Mr. Commanday? Oh, well, that's great. Well, anyway, he was a Russian lunatic who lived in Paris, Obouhov, one of the spellings. And he called himself Nicolas l'Illuminé, the illuminated, the inspired Nicholas, Nicolas Lobo. And he wrote a huge work, Le Livre de Vie, the Book of Life, no less, which he marked with his own blood instead of expression marks, and things. He, instead of using red ink, he used his own blood because he felt that this was the book of life, and it connected his experience in Russia, and eventually he went to Paris, and he dreamed of a real universal symphony for which he had an instrument constructed by Leon Theremin, the famous Russian engineer, in the form of a cross, and he called it La Croix Sonore, the sonorous, the sounding cross. No reference to anyone present. The sounding cross, and he wrote me numerous letters hoping that, particularly when I conducted the Hollywood Bowl, that this cross could be erected on top of a Hollywood mountain, and he could come with his livre de vie and blood and everything else and have that final rite, which was not unlike Scriabin's final mysterium, but Scriabin projected his mysterium for the Himalayas. He wouldn't compromise with Hollywood. He wanted the Himalayas, and he had ideas about suspended bells and all this sort of thing. Now, this is nothing new. But again, you go back to Berlioz or anybody, and you find such dreams. But Obukhov, I think he had something. And in fact, he was starving, and I asked Ravel to write me a letter of appreciation of Obukhov so that I could circulate Ravel's letter and collect some money for Obukhov. And so Ravel very graciously wrote that letter to me. And I didn't realize that Ravel's letter would be now worth about $400, as an autograph. But so I didn't sell that letter, but I circulated it in copies and collected $250 for Obukhov, and so he could live for a few months. And then a tragic thing occurred. His wife, who was extremely devoted to him, finally couldn't bear it anymore, and he kept his livre de vie, the score, under an altar, in an altar under an icon, and there were candles and everything. He worked as a bricklayer for a while, but then he couldn't work. And so his wife finally said, either you compose music or do something that people would play, or I'm through. And then one night, in a very Dostoevskian manner, she took a carving knife and went to that score, and he wounded. And she wounded that score badly. I mean, it was torn up, and Obukhov showed it to me. He never repaired the wounds in the blood, blood of the music. I mean, he was that kind of a guy. But the music is interesting.
About musical mystics, what about the British composer Sorabji? Do you know anything about him?
I know too much about him. Don't know where to begin. Whatever I would say would be libelous. But he was a remarkable guy. I mean, he's still living. He's living in a castle. He doesn't. His family was very rich, and he's not a British composer. He's a Parsi. Not to be confused with Indians. When I wrote him, and I said that I'm very much interested in Indian music, and that there are no Hindu composers and so forth, he wrote me back, said, "Don't you dare call me an Indian. I'm a Parsi. We came from Persia." So I said, "All right, Mr. Parsi, but I'm interested in your music." And so he did send me scores of his music, which are absolutely fantastic. Here's another composer whose works ought to be performed. He never sees anybody, doesn't receive anybody in his castle, and there is a sign, as another British composer referred to me, a big sign saying, "Visitors unwelcome. Nuns of the Roman Catholic Church may come only if wearing full habit without an introduction." In other words, he's nuts. But some of those nuts are geniuses, and he comes very close to being a genius. And I suppose that now his works could be performed, and the works of Obukhov. I believe that Obukhov would be next, and if anyone here who is interested in Obukhov, I think that his works, of course, I don't know what happened to that Livre de Vie. Kusevitsky played a fragment of that Livre de Vie. It was for 2 pianos, chorus, and a small orchestra. I was one of the pianists, and it said in the program, Les pianistes, Nicolas Slonimsky, and the composer. And a friend came up to me before the performance and said, "You'd better wear a sign on your back saying, 'I am not the composer,' so that I would not be harmed."
Our guest this afternoon on Thin Air has been Nicolas Slonimsky, 76-year-old Dean of American Musicology, and Robert Commanday has also been here, Chief Music Critic of the San Francisco Chronicle. This is Charles Amirkhanian. Thank you very much for listening.